Hello and welcome back to the Halo series. My name is Douglas Brown, CEO at Halo Consulting. Today we are joined by Alice Cheng, CEO and founder at TaxDrop. Glad you're able to join us, Alice. How are you today?
Good, feeling so good. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, we're happy to have you. If you're new to this event, Halo hosts monthly virtual roundtables covering current trends in the HR, tech, and DEI space. Don't forget to check out the Halo mini-series, where we hear from executives taking a deep dive into a multi-part series discussing what is keeping them up at night. If you've enjoyed this content, hit that like and subscribe button, and be sure to visit Halo's LinkedIn page to subscribe to the Halo Content Hub, which summarizes current market trends and recaps past events, and that link can be found in the description. Throughout our session, we will cover lessons learned and insights from a startup audit specialist. Before we kick off the questions, Alice, let's get started with you. Can you share with our audience where you started your career and how did it ultimately evolve into founding TaxDrop?
I graduated, entered the workforce working at Deloitte, which is one of the big four public accounting firms. And it was definitely more of a traditional accounting kind of career path. I always knew that I was interested in startups and tech. Small businesses and tech definitely have a way to innovate, just make change a lot quicker. So I knew that it was a space that somehow, some way I was going to enter. Later on, it was not until 2019. So the journey first started in 2016. And that's when I did kind of test the water as an accountant CPA, trying her hand at being a tech founder for the first time. Long story short, I worked with engineers and developed an app. It was going to be like a ZocDoc for finding an accountant. TaxDrop was born. For anyone listening and tuning in, of course, you guys could probably name 10 million different ways of funding your startup. There's, of course, bootstrapping. You could talk to angels. You could talk to institutional investors. Something that I had done as a first-time tech founder was 2016 is the first year that the Regulation Crowdfunding Act through the Jobs Act had been passed, and that became a whole new regulated avenue for startups to now be able to democratize startup funding. And it was a great new kind of thing that everyone was just learning about. So I've raised a small crowdfunding round myself, and that's how I entered the world of crowdfunding. That takes us all the way into 2019, where, long story short, my app didn't work out, but my experience at that point had gotten pretty deep, and I got to know investors. I became very intimate with the regulation crowdfunding space, and I understood exactly what was needed from both marketing, legal, and accounting end. And so TaxDrop today was born, which is where now we help startups launch their crowdfunding campaigns from the accounting side. Auditor, we help startups gear up their financials for the SEC filings and for investors to read for the first time.
Alice, thank you for sharing that context. And it sounds like your entrepreneurial journey started very early on in 2016, ultimately with a failed startup. But now you're here today with TaxDrop and having helped 300 startups since 2019, and that's a really cool achievable that you should be proud of.
I think you'll look back on your journey and realize that every pivot along the way was definitely not a planned pivot necessarily, but ultimately gets you to where you need to be.
Awesome. Let's dive into our first question, Alice. What inspired your startup-focused CPA firm's specialization in the financial statement audits and reviews, and how did you identify the need for this service in the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. Regulation crowdfunding is something that most of our projects come from. So when you go to think about companies getting audited, I think the common person thinks about publicly traded companies. Of course, these are the companies that are under a lot of scrutiny and have annual audit requirements, quarterly audit or filing investor requirements. But people don't tend to think of startups and small businesses because it's a private company. You're not under the same kind of compliance that a public company has to go through. And so really, unless you're being asked by your existing investors or maybe just trying to put in best corporate governance practices, you're probably not getting an audit, or you're not really intimate with what is the financial review process, what is an audit. Most of our clients actually come from the crowdfunding space, as I just mentioned. The other minority are maybe private companies that They don't have audit requirements per se, but they want to do best by corporate governance. And so that's something that they'll work with us on an annual basis for. That's a little bit of the history. I think it's just being able to service something that's a very niche market. So it just happens to be only for crowdfunding clients. At the end of the day, an audit is still an audit. Financial statements under US accounting standards are going to be the same no matter for what use case, which readers are going to be reading them. But that's the space that we are nichely serving.
That's a good segue into our next question. Can you share with our listeners about your current company and product? Who is the user, who is the buyer, and who is the audience in general?
Yeah, so this is an interesting relationship dynamic because ultimately the startup might hire us. We will work with the founders directly and the startup directly through the audit process. But the readers of the financials are the ultimate stakeholders of, the benefits of an audit, the benefit of an independent CPA firm coming in, providing assurance over those numbers. And so we've got different parties, different benefits. And so although maybe the primary customer base is the founders or the startups themselves, the beneficiaries of those audited financials are going to be the investors, the board, and any kind of investors that are looking to invest.
So if we were to give a quick summary, any startup founders or investors seeking GAAP financial statement reviews and audits looking to raise equity, they should reach out to you and your team, correct?
Definitely. There's normal legal, normal accounting, normal marketing. Any tech adjacent service provider that works with startups immediately knows that it's at the core, still accounting, still legal, still marketing, but you got to be able to work fast. You got to be able to speak the language of tech, of different personalities. You're working with founders who are very passionate about what they're building. Oftentimes they're building something that is not something that has non-existed. And so you've got to be able to keep up with industry. You've got to know what is going on in the tech world. And I think what's really good is that we specialize in servicing startups specifically. So oftentimes we'll meet a new client within 30 seconds of them just explaining what their business is, what they do. We immediately get it because we've seen a lot in the industries across the board, and we work with a lot of their peers and are able to just immediately get that immediate language.
Let's move on to our next question. When working with founders who don't have a background in finance or accounting, what difficulties do you usually face? And additionally, how do you assist them in navigating the financial aspects of their fundraising objectives?
It's a good question. I think that, me and my team talk about a lot. And I've talked with investors about this topic a lot too. In a perfect world, every startup would have a full-blown finance and accounting department, right? Corporate governance is oftentimes something that falls to the immediate, the back burner. Startup founders are looking to spend their time and effort on building their product. And it makes sense, right? As a startup, you're probably making up processes as you go along. Oftentimes, you're not familiar of what kind of corporate governance or best practices you need to have in place until maybe you have very knowledgeable board members who can help advise and bring in their experience, or regardless, you're making it up as you go along, right? And I think a lot of first-time founders would benefit from putting, good corporate governance in place and spending, I know it's annoying, but spending that necessary time on a routine basis, if not monthly, weekly, to know what your company's finances are, right? And we think about, of course, you've got to know your company's finances, but I think a lot of first-time founders don't realize just how critical it is. There's no working on marketing without knowing what your costs are, what's going to be a sustainable business model for you. Are you pricing your product the right price? Do you know what your margins are? And we oftentimes see a lot of first-time startup founders push the finance and accounting to the back burner and maybe only think about it once a year during tax time. But if you went a full year not knowing what was my true burn month over month, what are my true margins, what is the cyclical, potential seasonal sales cycle look like for a company. And you're only looking at that one time a year, you're probably not keeping up to date with doing right by your company on knowing what those true metrics are. So just putting finance and accounting, I think, at the forefront rather than some of the more back burner thoughts.
The biggest takeaway I had from your response, Alice, is finance and accounting should be at the forefront for startup founders and executives. Although looking to spend time building the product, putting best practices in place, really putting that emphasis on the corporate governance is super important, and should really be at the forefront for startups looking to scale and grow.
Exactly. I always think of like a clean room analogy where you could be an organized person, you could be messy. Ultimately, when it comes to time when you really need to go find something in your room, doesn't it feel much better where you know exactly where something's filed? You know that it's in alphabetical order, all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and it's just something that's at the touch of your fingertips. So you speak with a great investor who's really interested in your company, you've got all those metrics already ready to go. That would be the ideal situation.
Yep, got to cross your T's and dot your I's, and I think I'm going to take that back to my team and implement that. Having a clean room. Alice, from your experience, what are common financial due diligence mistakes that startups make, and how do you help your clients avoid them?
Yeah, so it's an interesting perspective that we have as startup auditor. So just a little bit of background. So as auditor, we don't have the same relationship or even authority as maybe a company bookkeeper, a company CFO. We come in as an independent third party. We have to maintain our independence requirements because the whole point is for this third party to come in and give you a stamp of approval if everything checks out, if everything's in compliance. So with that being said, we can't be the teacher who grades the homework and does that student's homework, right? And so I think to your question, common pitfalls is just if you're not investing in that finance and accounting function. But something that we've seen as startup auditors is not all startup accountants are created the same. So you definitely want to be able to speak and work with an accountant who knows your industry. So bookkeeping is not just about finding someone for $15 an hour on Fiverr or Upwork to kind of plug and chug your numbers into QuickBooks. If you are selling consumer goods, consumer products, or if you're a software company, you want to find an accountant that's highly knowledgeable in those respective spaces because they're going to know exactly what kind of offline calculations and schedules to maintain for your company. So I think it's not about saving time and cost. And then ultimately the end result is a lot more expensive to have to go through multiple years of cleanup. Or when you kind of look back and realize that things were not booked correctly. The right accountant also will be able to advise you on some concepts that you might not have thought about before. Investors, I think, oftentimes look at margins, they'll look at ratios, but from just a little highlight of a U.S. accounting standards perspective, there's topics like revenue recognition, where just because your company generated cash from a sale does not mean that you can necessarily recognize all of that cash on your profit and loss statement. There's a lot of nuances to what performance obligations does your company have to meet in order to recognize sales on your financials? Are you making sure that you're booking your software correctly? If you have, spent a lot of R&D on developing a platform for your company, it could be a website, it could be your proprietary IP. There's different accounting treatment for different buckets of those R&D costs. So, just to elaborate on my earlier point, it's definitely keeping finance accounting at the forefront, but then doing the necessary investment as well. So even though you might be hiring an accountant on a weekly basis, it's someone who knows the industry.
Yeah, I was going to say the biggest takeaway from your response is finance and accounting should be at the forefront, and
Yeah.
you need to hire someone that has experience in your industry and doesn't lead you astray.
Yeah. Well, and we'll mention it a few more times later on too, just in case.
Moving on to the next question, Alice. If you're a startup founder seeking to raise capital, any advice that you would share?
Startups run differently than I think your local mom and pop small business, right? With the current times that we're in, where maybe fundraising a little harder for certain industries, for certain startups, being more savvy and not to say cost reduction, but ultimately, from a startup founder perspective, I think that MVP method, coined the minimal viable product method, is always a really good way for a young startup to proceed, where in your mind you've got, grand plans for the company, but ultimately to be able to test a product or to get that first customer or even to gain traction as a company, you actually don't need something all that fancy. We see startups who spend thousands on working with very brand name vendors, the biggest law firms, the biggest marketing firms. And at the end of the day, something that's probably more cost efficient and meets your size and needs as a company is probably going to be better, because you could still find great startup lawyers, great startup marketing PR teams who aren't necessarily charging thousands of dollars an hour. And it's going to be a better use of your seed round, or, your investors are definitely going to appreciate that dollar going much farther than it otherwise would have been. So I think just founder to founder, always just when there's a will, there's a way, and it doesn't necessarily require money to be thrown at it.
And having worked with 300 plus startups in this field, what key insights have you gained?
Oftentimes when we wrap up an audit, a founder will ask us, just out of curiosity, how do we rank with other clients, other companies that you've seen? And it's an honest question. I'd be wondering the same thing too. The range is so wide that I think it's fair to say the key takeaway here is that, there's no right or wrong way to go about it. You've got to work with ultimately what's going to work best for you, your team, and your company. A lot of companies will not generate their first sale until they have spent millions in developing the perfect platform. And then we have seen many startups become very successful, and they've actually been able to make a lot of sale on, a product that is not perfect yet, but, just working with engineers, building it in-house. Everything's not perfect, not fancy, but I think it's just really tough in these times to be as, recklessly spending, not keeping finance accounting at the forefront, and not really thinking about the overall plan and what is going to put your company in the best position to be around this time next year, and not just thinking about the next month ahead.
Well said. And Alice, as a first-time founder, how did you approach the challenge of building a team, and what strategies did you use to attract top talent and ensure that your team was aligned with your company's mission, goals, and vision?
Good question. It's a small company. I think every member on the team really matters. Personally, as a founder, I think back to my experiences working on good teams and then some bad team experiences, and definitely drew from those on what I want to make sure our team, our company at TaxDrop had. And one of the number one things is this culture where everyone has a voice. And I think that said a lot, or people do what they can to make sure that's a practice that's instilled within their teams. We do something that is meeting bi-weekly. We also, or on a monthly basis, and then we just go around and allow everyone to share their thoughts. They have a process improvement suggestion. They don't even have to wait for that meeting once a month. Templates, update the documentation, setting that upward and downward feedback, honest, timely is really important. And then everyone feels like they are on the same page on what everyone on this team is moving forward and trying to achieve. So a little background, our team's currently 5 people, including me. So it's really not a lot. One person's out of office, you're down, 20% of your whole team. So everyone's contribution matters. Personally, I wanted to look for people who would be able to service the tech industry well. I think tech founders and the startup environment is very fast paced, and it actually does appreciate when you have members on a team that aren't afraid to contribute their thoughts. And so you need talent that feels like their voice is celebrated and that they're able to move as quickly as the environment demands it. So it's just rewarding that behavior.
Great. TaxDrop sounds like an awesome company to work for. Are you guys hiring at all?
Right now, we're not hiring, but I think I always say that, and then in a couple months, we end up looking to hire again. So I think it ebbs and flows. Ask me again in 2 months, and I might have a different answer.
Awesome. For those aspiring entrepreneurs in the tech industry, Alice, what advice would you give to others who are just starting their journey today?
Speaking from my own experience, a non-traditional entrance into tech, because I went to school and majored in accounting. I was very interested in everything that startups had to offer and the way that they impacted the market. But I honestly had to read a lot of startup books and kind of learn all the lingo for the first time, in a position where I was constantly comparing myself to what I thought I should be doing or what other people were doing. And looking back on all those years, I think the best decisions I made, or the most authentic moves, were the ones where I did not, compare myself to, this is what the books are saying to do, or this is what those how to kind of like quick success articles or medium articles are advising you to do. There's definitely advice. There's good advice in a lot of those, but I think just being authentic as a person, as a business, just how you do anything is how you do everything. And I think the universe always works out best when you're able to just kind of move authentically.
I have a follow-up question. What are some important lessons that you've learned on your journey to building a successful startup?
I will say a huge lesson, and call me out for the irony in this, is I'm here preaching, the importance of the finance and accounting function. But as I was going through my business for the first time, back when I was, still just a solo founder, I didn't have a team. I was finding my footing. And I think what a lot of companies do, small business or startup, is to get that traction or to get that customer, you might do things that are not sustainable for your company, like undercharge. It's just not scalable. You are not representing your value, and you're definitely not getting that back in your price. So I don't know if I would necessarily call it a mistake. I'm really happy about where our company is today. So maybe that was just a necessary kind of stepping stone to get to where we are today. Back on my experience, I don't think it was necessarily mandatory to have done that, because I do look at, our clients too. Many of them have started maybe 7 years ago and are seeking their first round of funding. Many of them are actually still in the ideation stage. So they just have a concept. They've got a team. They have no product built. But then you look at their cap table, and we're auditing their financials, and they were able to get a lot of support behind it. So, there's the key takeaways here are that you have to do what feels right for you, move authentically. And if you feel like you need to do things that ultimately undermine your company just to get the customer, just know that there are other companies out there who don't need to do that. And so maybe it's better to lose that customer, because then you're closer to just focusing your time and effort on the right niche market that you should be working with, actually.
I really like how you mentioned to move authentically, and ultimately everything will kind of happen for a reason. The stars will align. So that really resonated with me, Alice.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think just the time that you dedicate towards things that are not going to move you in the right direction, it takes away from um, opening yourself to opportunities that better align for you.
Exactly. Well said. As we wrap up with our final two questions, who should reach out to you and why? And what's the best way to connect with you or get in touch with our audience?
There's two groups that benefit most from working with us. One is, of course, if you're a startup that's looking for an auditor for either a crowdfunding purpose or maybe your existing investors. As you mentioned, the count actually just checked. We're at 360 startups now that we've helped.
Wow.
We would love to help. Secondly, if you guys are investors who are looking to work with a startup auditor who gets the space and is able to provide that benefit for your portfolio or potential new targets or new deals. That's also something that we specialize in working with as well.
Wow. 316 startups. Is that the number?
360.
Oh, 360. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations.
There.
Okay, nice. Alice, the last question we have for you, is there anything that you'd like to share or talk about in terms of the work you're doing today at TaxDrop or personally?
I'm really excited just to just continue servicing startups. Every time, we work with a new startup, we've worked with some big names out there, and it's always exciting to see their products on shelves. Or for some reason, after we audit a client, we get their Instagram advertisements on our respective social media pages. So we always find that really funny. We're putting our firm in a position to be able to be that go-to auditor as someone who is very, well versed within the crowdfunding and the startup space. So our company's partnering with more and more investors to become those the due diligence auditors, and it's something that's going to set a lot of their portfolio companies up for success.
Thanks again for your time, Alice. Keep up the great work, and we're cheering you on from the sidelines.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Doug.